Today we're back again discussing the flood in the time of Noah. What was it like for a person living at the time of Noah when the flood arrived? The day came and suddenly the unthinkable began to take place. What that crazy guy everyone laughed at, his words began to come back and they had to pause and wonder, was he right all along? We're going to look at today the scripture, what it reveals about what happened when the flood came. Today on Truth Matters. Today, truth is denied, ignored, and resisted with open hostility. Yet in life and in times of crisis, we discover that truth matters. Before I begin, I want to take care of a little housekeeping. First of all, I'd like to hear from you in the comments section about Truth Matters. Are you enjoying it? I'd like to know. Make some comments, maybe ask some questions, particular episode, and let me hear from you. It really does help. Secondly, I'd like to ask you to share, like, and subscribe to Truth Matters as well. It really is valuable in helping us put out the material that we do. Now, if you've subscribed before, let me ask you to subscribe again. The reason for this might be obvious for some of you because I've heard from you. Several weeks ago, something occurred on YouTube, particularly my channel, and several subscribers no longer found themselves subscribed, and so they no longer received notifications and had trouble finding me. I myself had to re-sign into the channel. Therefore, sign in, resubscribe, and click for notifications. Thanks for tuning in. I work hard to produce the content, and I don't want you to miss any episode. Your tuning in matters to me. So let's get back to Noah. There's probably never been a time in human history when predicting the weather and people's awareness of the weather has been more keen. We have radar, computer models, and a non-stop weather persons providing us forecasts on an hourly basis. We even have a weather channel dedicated to teaching and informing the public on everything having to do with weather. What's puzzling is with all of that at our disposal, weather events still catch us by surprise and people are harmed and killed by storms of various kinds. There are a couple of factors, of course, that play into this. Truth is, there's an aspect of our weather that is totally beyond the control or predicting power of mankind despite all of our technology. Another factor, of course, comes into play, and that is that people are either unaware of the weather warnings or they're just not paying attention. Either one of these can place a person in harm's way when it comes to the weather. Now, at the time of Noah, they had no such weather forecasting. But I'm sure with the long lifetimes that individuals had, and that they had a good idea, they'd obtained a good idea of weather patterns and seasons. But in the case of Noah and his predictions, I'm certain that almost everyone had totally stopped listening to him and his warnings. Let's begin looking at the context of this flood narrative. The full narrative is covered in Genesis 6:9 through 9:19. And the structure that's used in this narrative is something called chiastic structure. Simply defined, this is a literary device where words, grammatical construction, or concepts are presented in a particular order and then repeated in reverse order. I don't want to get too bogged down in this. It's better understood visually, which really works for me because I myself am a visual learner. And you'll see what I mean if I show this to you. Genesis 6:9 through 10 is a transitional introduction of Noah and his sons. In Genesis 6:11 through 12, you have the corruption of all flesh. In Genesis 6:13 through 22, God resolves to destroy the earth by a flood. In Genesis 7:1 through 10, God commands Noah to enter the ark. Genesis 7:11 through 16 is the beginning of the flood over all the earth. In Genesis 7:12 through 24, the waters rise. In Genesis 8:1a, we see the central theme of the flood. God remembered Noah. Now the pattern goes in reverse. Genesis 8:1b through 5, waters recede. In Genesis 8, 6 through 14 is the end of the flood and the drying of the land. In Genesis 8, 15 through 19, God commands Noah to leave the ark. In Genesis 8, 20 through 22, God resolves to never again destroy the earth by a flood. In Genesis 9, 1 through 17, God makes a covenant with all flesh. And then in Genesis 8, 18 through 19 is a transition conclusion with Noah and his sons. Now, this same pattern is also seen in the stating of numbers in relation to the progression of time. We have 7 days in Genesis 7:4 and 7:10, then 40 days in 7:12, 150 days in 7:24. Then the progression repeats again with 150 days in 8:3, then 40 days in 8:3, then 7 days in 8:10 and 8:12. Now you may ask, why is this important? You see, there have been those who desire to disregard the flood account as a myth created from different sources. But what you see in this structure is a single author using an organized technique to convey that this flood had both a method and a message. It wasn't a haphazard event. Also, the flood is more than a work of wrath. It was that, but it was more than that. And at the center of the story was a message of redemption. Noah, his family, and the creatures of the earth were being rescued. God's purpose was not doomed. His compassion is on display even in the flood. And also, at the center of this narrative is this statement: God remembered Noah. His redemption comes out of his promise. He promised to rescue Noah, and what did he do? He did rescue him. This is a story of old promises kept and new promises declared with a colored bow in the sky. In our context of our present wicked world, our trust is in a promise-keeping God. He remembers his people and the promises that he makes. That's important to remember. This is what happened in the flood. God saves his people. Living in a wicked world, he saves them. Now comes the hard part. In order to rescue, he brought a flood. This flood covered the whole world. Let's look at it. Noah built an ark. Genesis 6:15 says, "The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and the height 30 cubits. The dimension of the ark was about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. It had 3 levels for all the passengers, man, and animals. Noah and his sons worked 120 years preparing the ark. There had been ample time of warning, preaching, and demonstrating that the flood was coming. But they didn't listen. Although the Bible doesn't describe their response, there's no reason to believe that Noah didn't face hostility from the world around him. It was a wicked world, but he obeyed God. Then in Genesis 7:1, God told Noah to enter the ark. Genesis 7:16 states that God closed the door behind him. Then for 7 days they were in the ark, obedient to the command of God, waiting. Then after 7 days, it came. Man, did it come. In Genesis 7:10 and 11, it says, "Now it came about after 7 days that the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open." It happened just as God said it would. In these 2 short phrases come a simplification of an unrepeated catastrophe. Nothing like it had ever happened. This event reshaped the entire globe. The old world was destroyed and covered. It says the fountains of the great deep burst open. From deep within the earth, waters burst forth upon the surface of the land. Now, several theories have been proposed as to what this means. Myself, I don't know. I read recently an article that reported this. Try this one on for size. Did you know that there's an absolutely massive supply of water hidden underneath the Earth's crust that's 3 times bigger than the oceans that sit on the surface? This huge supply of water is buried a whopping 400 miles underground, so it's not exactly accessible. Do tell. I guess that's a source that only God could access. But regardless, before scientists made their discovery, God declared that he burst water from the great deep, and it was lots of water. It also says that the floodgates of the sky were open. Genesis 7:17 states, "Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The waters came down, and the waters burst forth, and the levels increased, and it lifted the ark." The waters were rising and increasing in depth. Genesis 7:19 through 20 adds to this to the description. "And the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all of the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered." More and more waters rise. Every day it's getting higher and higher. It says the waters eventually prevailed, conquered the highest mountains by 15 cubits, or about 23 feet. Interesting fact, the ark was 45 feet tall. It likely sat less than halfway in the water, putting it less than 22 feet deep in the water. So even the highest mountains, and certainly the land, was safely below the ark's hull. God didn't miss a detail, did he? No, he didn't. One more detail. Genesis 7:24 said, "The water prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. The flood was not simply a 40-day event. The water completely conquested or conquered over the land, and it lasted for 150 days. The conquest was overpowering and unavoidable. There was another 221 days of draining the waters, making Noah's total time in the ark 371 days. Don't miss another detail. Genesis 7:23 makes the extent of the flood very clear. "So he wiped out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from mankind to animals to crawling things and the birds in the sky, and they were wiped out from the earth. And only Noah was left together with those with him in the ark." Every living thing that was upon the face of the land. There were no survivors on the land. God lists the categories to make the point very clear. Mankind to animals to crawling things and the birds of the sky. All of them were wiped out. This is complete and utter destruction. The only exceptions were those who were in the ark. The details here are important. Why? It's because there are those, even believers, who propose that the flood wasn't local, not worldwide. Well, modern sensibilities and desire to not stand out, or simply a reluctance to trust the written testimony of Scripture, has some seeking to alter what is clearly written. But it's the details that testify against any attempt to alter what God clearly stated. God didn't record the screams of the perishing, but he left no doubt that they were all destroyed. God didn't perfectly describe the geological process, but there should be no doubt that he radically altered the earth to fulfill his edict. As I mentioned last week, the earth records that layers of sediment were laid out across the whole globe. The fossils testify that the world suffered a sudden and horrifying destructive event. The details are there. The flood happened just as God said. What am I saying by all this? Everything happened just as God said it would. It always happens just as God says it will. He told Noah to warn the people, and Noah did. They didn't believe, and they perished. If you ignore the warnings of God, there are horrific consequences. Ignoring God and His Word never ends well. Never, never. But if you listen, He told Noah that it was coming, and it came. God told him that an ark built to the specifications given would provide a way through the waters, and it did. God made the waters to recede, and they did. Dry land returned, and Noah was finally able to leave the ark. All of it just like God said. How did the flood happen? It happened just like God said it would. To say that God is faithful is both a warning and a blessing. It all depends on how a person responds to what He says. It was that way in the past. It's that way in the present. And it will be that way in the future. Our God is faithful. Let that be a warning and a hope to those of us in these difficult times. Our God is faithful. But the only safe place before a faithful God is in trusting and finding His hope and His redemption. Our God is faithful. He will keep His word, both to save and to judge. Why? Because the truth of God matters.